President Obama has had on our lives has been very meaningful. But this initiative, or the speech that he gave when he launched the initiative at Lehman College in the Bronx, I could say was probably one of the most impactful things that I ever heard him say, particularly to me. Because I do think with having this position of being the first African-American speaker in the history of New York State, I felt that it was incumbent upon me to carry out the charge that President Obama had given us.
Hey, welcome to another edition of The Morning Stretch. I'm your host, Tony Herbert. Good morning and happy Sunday. We're across the street from City Hall, right here in front of 250 Broadway, to come and speak with the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, Carl Hastings. Join me upstairs. Got some questions I'd like to ask him. So come on in, let's have some fun. Assemblyman, thanks for the opportunity to be here with you. I kind of want to get a sense of what it is to be from the Bronx and to go to and excel to probably one of the top positions, one step away from the governor's office, that you've been able to take. Tell us a little bit about that experience coming from the Bronx and getting to this point.
I would say, when it all first happened, it was very humbling. But you do like a self-assessment. Mm-hmm. Is this something you want to do? Can you do it? And when you go through that internal exercise and then you see that people, your colleagues want to support you, it's a very humbling experience. But then also knowing back home that I had a lot of support in the community is kind of what put it together. And then to feel like you could be one of the people who could actually really on behalf of the Assembly articulate things that you feel people need in this state. It is to be one of the so-called three men in the room, mm-hmm. And to be the first one of color to do that I thought it was very important. It helps to shift some of the discussions. I can say the Assembly Democrats, even under my predecessor, we spoke up on things that were important, but I think with me being there, it kind of just allows a little different perspective and life experience when you have someone of color talking about those issues.
Now walk us through this. Where do you come from in the Bronx, and what school did you attend and all that good stuff?
I've lived in my Assembly district my entire life, mm-hmm. except for the years that I was away at Stony Brook University.
Okay, that was a party school.
Yeah. It was. I did my share party. But I got my degree while I was in all of that. But it's a very middle class neighborhood. Mm-hmm. But we have our pockets of struggling and poverty.
Now, what part of the Bronx is that?
Northeast Bronx.
Northeast Bronx, okay.
Main streets, Gun Hill Road, White Plains Road, Boston Road, mm-hmm. Right outside of Co-op City.
Right.
One of the northernmost points of New York City that I do represent. And I graduated from Truman High School in Co-op City, although I did spend 1 year at Brooklyn Tech. I did take the specialized exams that people have been talking about recently, and those experiences, although I said it's a very middle class mm-hmm. neighborhood, but some of the life struggles that you want to see and want to try to change, I've experienced those growing up in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
We saw the crack epidemic, and things like that, with the devastation that it did to families, even health and people being arrested, and mm-hmm. also the damage that it did to families and communities as well. So then to be able to be in this position, to try to push for things that you think that will benefit people that you've observed in your life that need help and attention.
So now, you actually were an Assembly member for how long?
Before I became Speaker, that was 14 years.
14 years. Then you became, but actually you're also one of the most powerful guys in the Bronx. You were also the county leader.
No, I gave up being county leader.
That's a word.
When I was elected Speaker,
right.
I gave up being county chair.
Right. But that definitely will some influence to be able to do the things that you need to get done in your district, correct?
Well, I think when being county chair did help. It showed that you could get consensus, bring people together. Bronx is very diverse.
Right.
Population, you have to work with all communities, and I do think that was one of the things that was very helpful to me when I did say to my colleagues that I'd hope to gain their support to become
mm-hmm.
Speaker of the Assembly.
Now, what has surprised you most about this job?
That it's easier than being county chair.
Is it, let me ask this question. I mean, you have a lot of folks you have to cater to now because you're talking about the entire state. Is it difficult to have to balance that you have to represent your district, but also be that voice for those that live upstate? How does that work out for you?
It's not a difficult balance. It is a balance. Often I do have to apologize to my constituents that may have seen me come to their event for 11 straight years.
Right.
That maybe I won't be able to make it that year, but they've been very understanding, very supportive. They understand the importance, and I'm not shy to say I care about all 150 assembly districts, but there's one that's first amongst equals, which is mine, and then also the Bronx. I love all 62 counties, but the Bronx in my heart will always be first among equals.
Gotcha.
And I think the people in the Bronx have been satisfied with that, and they also give me a pass when I can't make it to every single event that they do invite me to.
Now talk to us how important it is being African American and being the speaker. How important is that for this state?
Well, I think it kind of changed the dynamic a little bit. I'd say for the previous 200 and something years that we were a state, it was always 3 white males that usually had these discussions. But I do think I get to bring a different perspective. A lot of the progressive things that has happened in the last few years, happened with me becoming a speaker, raised the age, was very important to us, increasing the minimum wage, paid family leave, the discussion around criminal justice reform now, trying to speedy trial, discovery reform, ending the cash bail system. These are, I think, different perspectives that I'm trying to push, and I do think with me being African American, it's I think people seem to be more open to it when you speak from that perspective. How sometimes the criminal justice system hasn't been fair to people of color.
Now, some of the things you've outlined, is that your legislative agenda going into the new terms, or is that just an ongoing set of circumstances?
It's ongoing. When I first got elected speaker, we said we wanted to have a families first agenda. We've tried to do that, put more money into education, higher education. As I said, raise the age. We did My Brother's Keeper, which was President Obama's initiative to change the outcomes of young men of color. And clearly with some of the gang activity that's been happening, particularly in the Bronx, we have more work to do in that endeavor. But it's an ongoing agenda, and hopefully if we get a Democratic Senate, maybe we could do some more of these things, particularly around criminal justice reform.
Well, you get the Democratic Senate, hopefully, right, as well as you have a Democratic Assembly, and you have to work with a Democratic governor. How is it working with Andrew Cuomo, and what's your relationship like with him?
No, our relationship is fine. I think it's inherent that executives in the legislature are always going to disagree. But I think on most things, particularly in the social side of things, I think the governor's been there. He was I wasn't even speaker then, but he ushered through marriage equality. But since then, we've worked on paid family leave together, minimum wage, raise the age, free college tuition for families under $125,000 a year. So the relationship has been fine.
Now, has there been any, speaking of the free college tuition thing, that's always been a sticking point for me because we work with a lot of young people in the community who want to go to college. Has there been any glitches, or you guys been able to work this thing out that it's a smooth transition for everybody that applies?
The opportunity for families to make who make under $125,000, which is a lot, to have that opportunity, we found that we have more people applying than what's available, and it always comes down to resources. And it is difficult. I remember when I went to college 100 years ago, the tuition at Stony Brook was only $750 a semester. And if you look back 50 and 60 years ago, CUNY was free. And free for all students. And I think that that's one of the growing crises that we have here in New York, and I think across the country, is college affordability. The amount of debt that students are having when they come home. That's why I think, particularly in New York, some graduates are staying home longer than they want because they're paying the mortgage sides, student loan debt, and quite frankly, why some young people are relocating to states that are cheaper.
Let's talk about the Attorney General's race right now. I mean, you were basically the person everybody was looking at, saying this is where the decision is going to be made. What's your thought process with regards to who should have that seat, or better yet, who's more qualified? And at this point, where do we go from here in getting the right person in that job?
When Eric Schneiderman resigned, I had said it's the legislature's prerogative to pick a successor.
Right.
And I just wanted the legislature's role to be respected, even though editorial boards, even the former U.S. attorney said let Miss Underwood stay. We never said that we were opposed to anything, but she would have been acting, the word acting, unless the legislature acted. And that's kind of all that I said. She has an impressive resume. I think she's been doing a phenomenal job while she's had the job. But on the political side of it, you know, I support Tish James. I've known her for a very long time. I think it would be tremendous if she would become the first African American woman to be elected
Attorney General,
Attorney General statewide. I've worked with her for a number of years. I was one of the first people to endorse her in 2013. The other candidates, you know, some I know better than others, but I believe that Tish would do the best job because she's kind of turned the public advocate's office into a mini attorney general type of trying to speak up and represent people who may have felt disenfranchised.
Well, I don't think a lot of people give her credit because she actually did work for the Attorney General. Actually, we were neighbors. She lived around the corner from me. So that's at that point, that's when she was with the Attorney General in Prospect Heights, and before she became the council member. So I think your choice is good. Let's talk a little bit more about you. You know, with regards to the ambitions of your office, and what do we do right now to change the dynamics of what's happening in New York City as it relates to crime, if you want to talk about that, because they're saying there's an uptick in the Bronx. I think I read somewhere 92% uptick somewhere in the categories of not only rape, gang violence, assaults, and stuff like that. But what do we do to change that dynamic?
But before this upswing, the Bronx, statistically, I think had been the safest it's been in 50 years. And I think when you do have these upswings, we're just hoping that it's temporary. But I do think that there has to be a wake-up call, particularly on gang activity that's not just happening in the Bronx. I think it's just kind of metastasized itself in the Bronx at this point. But these gangs are operating, you know, all over the city and in many places. But I would hope that this would now the mayor and the police commissioner would refocus their efforts to really, and even us in the community and elected officials, we really have to get at the heart of you know, why young people get involved in gangs in the first place.
Do you think that there should be some type of a community, state, citywide task force working together to go after this measure? Because if we don't get on top of it right now, we're going back to the days of the gangs of New York, if you recall those.
Well, whether it's a task force or not, I think it takes the government to provide resources. I think it's parents to still to engage their children. I think it's up to the police department that when these activities are happening, for them to act to disrupt them. So I think whether it's a task force or just an acknowledgement by all partners in the community, I think it's going to take all of us to really to get at this.
Now let's talk about the mayor. You just brought him up briefly. He's been coming and calling for Albany for all kind of help. For the most part, saying that Albany is responsible, Albany needs to do this. Truth be told, i.e., like NYCHA.
I would like to say it's my pleasure to be here today, but it's not. The conditions we saw, once again, are just disgusting. Okay.
The governor at the Forest Houses in the Bronx not 24 hours after de Blasio scoffed his NYCHA visit as
a political opportunistic act. The hypocrisy is the governor's getting his photo op but not handing over the money. I mean, I say put your money where your mouth is.
But with these two, for every punch, there is a counter punch.
Do you think for 1 minute, if the tenants of NYCHA were powerful and wealthy, this city would be saying it's going to take us 4 years to change a boiler?
Cuomo said he wouldn't sign the state budget unless it has more money for NYCHA repairs and a requirement that an outside contractor do them. He blamed politicians for the NYCHA chaos, forgetting perhaps that he is a politician too.
Tell the politicians enough is enough.
Cuomo came with his corner man, Councilman Richie Torres, who also lit into the mayor.
The residents of public housing have gotten a raw deal from the mayor. They have gotten progressive lip service without progressive living conditions.
The issue with NYCHA, what's your thought process with what's happening with New York City Housing Authority to date? And should there be criminal charges there?
Well, I'm not well versed in. I know that there's ongoing investigations on what happened, and I think if people did submit improper paperwork, that should be looked at.
Right.
But to what level that of deception, if it's criminal, there's investigations happening, and we'll look forward to the outcome of those investigations. But I think that what we're now seeing in NYCHA is the same thing we're seeing with the subway, that when you have infrastructure that is decades and decades old, and when it's not been funded or rehabilitated or maintained, this is what happens. You end up becoming in a crisis. The federal government has the amount of money that the federal government has been given NYCHA and even to the MTA has been diminished over time. And so in some vein, the city and the state recently, again, since the time I've become speaker, we've, in working with the governor, we put in $550 million towards NYCHA in the last 4 budget cycles to try to mitigate this. But NYCHA is going to need billions of dollars to get out of this problem.
Well, we've been able to identify, maybe you can help me, they found $10 billion to build new jails. And there's a $4 billion surplus in the city of New York. How come we don't have the money to fix NYCHA, if that be the case? Are we talking about building jails more so than fixing buildings where people actually live and making them homeless? Or what's your thought process on it?
I think the discussion around the building of the jails in the different boroughs, I think, comes back to everybody's desire to close Rikers Island, do criminal justice reform. But I don't think reforming the criminal justice system and rebuilding NYCHA, they don't have to be forsaken, for each other. But the NYCHA is primarily the responsibility of the federal government. But I think recently now, since the federal government, the funding for public housing has diminished, I think it has required the state and the city to step up, and we're going to have to come up with more creative ways, because I don't think enough funding is going to be coming from a Republican administration in Washington.
Now, your predecessor, Speaker Shelley Silver, he has been known for using the bully pulpit to get things done and pushing some of the assembly members to get what he needs. I understand you have a different tactic. What would that be, and how does that work for you?
Well, since I was a member when Speaker Silver was there. He wasn't a dictator, but I think what I've tried to do is he was a consensus builder, but I think I probably have a little more patience than he had to really let the discussion be open and let that direction do it. Sometimes he would come in and give his opinion on where things should go, and sometimes when the leader comes in and gives his opinion, that does send a message somewhat of, is this the direction we should go in? Right. And it influences, as for instance, until we're ready to move on a bill, I don't co-sponsor or sign on to bills, because I don't want to give the impression one way or the other on how I feel about a bill. I'd like to let the members themselves speak up on it. But I always felt that when I was there, even when I was a member, that I felt that I could help guide where the assembly went. It wasn't a dictatorship when Speaker Silver was there.
Gotcha. What was your position on the Constitutional Convention? And I actually get a quote here, where some of the points pushed for by the supporters, and what are your positions on some of the things that they were saying there was a need for the convention?
No. Yeah. Yes.
Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie is talking about how he would like to see New Yorkers vote next week on 3 separate ballot questions. Question 1 asked New Yorkers to authorize a constitutional convention. Hasty says he believes opening up the entire Constitution would be a big mistake, and there are better ways to reform government.
People aren't happy with what the legislature's done. They could always take the opportunity and vote us out. And so we are accountable to people, whether we do constitutional amendments or not. And I'd like to remind people that in the last 20 years, we've put more than 20 constitutional amendments on the ballot. Let me give you the reasons why I said that there wasn't.
Okay.
When you vote for the electors of the convention, it's basically electing a temporary two-year legislature.
Mm-hmm.
There's already a process in place to change or amend the Constitution.
Right.
We've done that. I'd say I believe 20-something, maybe be close to 30 times since the last constitutional convention. And the thing is, if you elect these temporary legislators as delegates to the convention, after that they disappear. But if I've done the right thing or wrong thing, I still have to come and ask you to support me every 2 years. And I think it's opening up the Constitution is not something that we should take lightly. And what I said even to those who supported the Constitutional Convention was, the Constitutional Convention isn't just about the things that you think the legislature hasn't done. Everything becomes on the table. Workers' rights, all kind of things that have been guaranteed to us in the Constitution. All of that is, comes into play.
Now, Governor Cuomo, and I quote here, stated that the state was operating at a deficit. So he pushed for the convention himself. Now, that we should not spend what we can't afford. Do you agree with that?
In general, on the convention?
Well, I mean, in total. I mean, with regards to the fact that New York supposedly is operating in a deficit, so we should be cutting back.
Well, we did have I'd say a budget deficit, but I think we still did as best that we could, in terms of even with a $4 billion deficit, we still added almost $1 billion more in spending for education. Would love to it have been more, but sometimes you have to deal with those realities. The economy goes in cycles, and when it's a downward cycle, you have to adjust a little bit. And I think that's probably what the governor had meant. But when he was first elected, there was a $10 billion budget deficit, and there actually was no increase in education. So I think we were able to manage it, that at least with a $4 billion budget deficit, we were still able to put money towards our priorities. Not as much, again, as I would like to have seen, or the members would like to have seen, but we did the best we could.
Speaking of budget issues around the idea of homelessness in our communities, particularly in New York City, where we have, 60,000 people that are in our homeless shelters, of which 25 to 28,000 of them are kids. What can the state do, or has the state done enough to be able to help in that situation?
Well, there's always funding, there's always resources, then there's always laws that you can do to help. I think one of the things that we have to start to look at in terms of homelessness is we shouldn't just react once the families are homeless. I do think that we should be looking at ways of when people seem to be at that critical point of almost being homeless, could we intervene and maybe sometimes even help them out? Because helping somebody who's at the, almost at the close of being evicted, helping them out financially may still be in the best interest of the city financially. Because once they're evicted, the amount of money that the city has to spend for a family that's evicted is much more than it would take to keep the families in their home.
Now, speaking of something like that, now, let give you an example. The city has said, the mayor particularly, has put himself in a position to say that those that are being evicted, that he's going to provide an opportunity for them to have legal representation.
Helping residents avoid eviction. That's what Mayor de Blasio says he plans to do.
We're investing $12.3 million in a very powerful tool, free legal services for tenants facing eviction and who are victims of harassment by unscrupulous landlords.
De Blasio announced his initiative at a news conference at City Hall. His strategy? Hire attorneys for tenants who cannot afford legal backup.
And there are strong and clear laws against such harassment, against forced evictions. But so many of our tenants who are in these situations don't have the legal support they need.
The mayor says unscrupulous landlords are creating illegal circumstances.
When my landlord came to me and told me that he needed me to move out, I was in a state of shock. It's no way. Why? What did I do?
In Richardson's case, an attorney made a world of difference.
She presented all of her evidence to the judge, and the decision was I would not be evicted, and my whole building is now rent stabilized. And that not only helped me, but it helped every other tenant that was in the building.
De Blasio says when it comes to the issue of homelessness, New Yorkers need to know they have support.
We will help people every step of the way, whether it's before they might become homeless, if, God forbid, they find themselves homeless, and most importantly, getting them out of shelter and into permanent housing.
But yet, the legal representation he's putting up there is to go after the very legal representation he's sending to get them evicted in the city, particularly those that live in housing. Is that a waste of money in our community or in our city, or how do we get around that kind of governance?
No, I do think it's important. Anytime I think any individual is faced with a court proceeding, none of us, if you're not a lawyer, and even if you're a lawyer, you still shouldn't represent yourself. But I think that it's always important in this legal system to have representation.
Right.
But in terms of the, again, back to the homeless crisis, there are mandates that the city has. They have to take care of somebody if they've been deemed. But I really think we have to, again, a lot of times, based on financial constraint, you have to deal with what you have now.
Right.
But I do think at some point we do have to look to plan out to say if we reduce people who are on their way to being homeless, that in itself will reduce the homeless population.
All right, but let me go back around to this point again. And I mean, I know that you're fiscally responsible with regards to what happens in the state. So you look at the budget to make sure that it makes sense. Now, here it is. We're saying that in the city of New York, we're hiring attorneys to go after the very attorneys we hired to go after you, to protect the quote unquote the interests of the individuals.
Well, a lot of the attorneys, unless you're saying it's public housing.
I'm speaking in the essence of public housing. If you go down to 140 Livingston or 141, whatever that is, you see a bunch of people in there from housing who are being evicted. Right. But they tell them to go in a room, that there should be some attorneys in there that can help them at the same token, but they're paid by the city. But it's the city attorneys going after them to evict them.
But my point is, whether there's a legal proceeding on which side, I think people should be entitled to representation. I understand the point that you're trying to make. That
is it a waste of money?
I don't think it's a waste of money. If people are in an eviction proceeding, there's usually a reason why. It's either something that's happened with the tenant financially.
Right.
Sometimes they've had someone in the household that's happened where they can't afford it financially, someone's health. Or it's something with the landlord. So, but I think for whatever reason, NYCHA may want to put forward why the tenant should be evicted. I think it's equally important for that person to be able to respond, even though it looks like the city is paying for both ends of the court proceeding. The proceeding itself, both parties should be represented by counsel.
Interesting. All right, interesting point. Let me jump over to the jail concept that we spoke about. You know, with the jail population dropping to the lows that everybody's talking about right now, that we've seen the lowest numbers we've seen in decades, quite frankly. Is the call for bail reform overblown, and are there risks understated?
I don't think the call is overblown. We have had a system, and even judges have unfairly used the system. Bail is only supposed to ensure that a person shows up. It's not really to assume that when you're out on bail you're going to do another crime. That's not what bail was set up for. But it has been used in that manner. That sometimes the severity of the crime, threats to society, has been used in a punitive way because then the bail is set at a very high number. But if you're a very rich person and the bail is set at a very high number, it doesn't matter. If you look at in the instance with Harvey Weinstein, he was very wealthy. He had $1 million bail set. He just went in. He just had a 2-hour proceeding, and then he walked right out. But so we have a system that if you're wealthy, you don't have to spend a lot of time in jail, whether based on the crime, but particularly people who don't have the means, you get accused of a crime. And even now, the numbers are saying that about 3/4 of people who are in Rikers Island now have been convicted of nothing. And so even the proposal that we put forward in the Assembly, it's really about nonviolent felonies and misdemeanors. that people should not be held in jail when they're accused of a crime because they can't come up with a couple $100.
Well, you had an instant where, and not to cut you off, I'm sorry, Speaker, you had an instant where there was an individual. He actually participated in the robbery of a livery cab. The livery cab driver, trying to defend those that were around him, wound up getting his thumb cut off. This same individual went home, got arrested, and was able to get home for dinner on a $200 bail, in time for dinner. And then you turn around and you had an individual who was arrested out on bail, and while out on bail, allegedly committed a rape. So the concern again is that's why we're saying are the risks understated with regards to how people are being let out and not given proper
But I'll
bails.
say this to you. Harvey Weinstein, a guy who's been accused of multiple rapes, but because he had $1 million, he was able to come out. So if people, that goes back to my point. If it's about the threats to society, if you're rich, you can still make it out.
Yeah, we've got some work to do there, huh? Let's go back to raise the age. I know you talked about it. Are we doing enough for raise the age? And then the question I say, is there anything in the law that would prevent adults from using these same young people to go out there and carry out their criminal activities because they know that they probably won't get arrested or will be released on ROR?
Well, a couple of things on that. The law hasn't technically taken effect. It will take effect later this year. I do think we should watch how it's implemented, but remember the whole reason behind Raise the Age was that we had 16 and 17-year-olds, particularly in nonviolent crimes, and some that are deemed violent but not necessarily violent, like burglary too, and robbery too, that if young people who don't have the right to vote, can't get a drink, can't even go defend this country, but why if they make a mistake when they're young, when we know that the adolescent mind doesn't really develop until they're in their 20s, that they should not be prosecuted as a criminal. So I think when the law does take effect, that was the purpose of it.
Right.
And I do think that we'll have to watch and see how effective it is, and we have to make sure that the resources are available, particularly for those 16 and 17-year-olds that we are trying to make sure don't get exposed to the adult criminal justice system.
And my other concern is with regards to the closing of Rikers Island. We hear people say that if you close Rikers Island, then things would be a lot better, it'd be a lot safer. Would that be not the sense if in case when you transfer the violence, you don't think that the violence would travel with it where it's going? And I'll give you an example. In Crossroads, there is the 15-year-olds that they're talking about that, primarily are these innocents and they should be, just be treated like, juveniles and not be treated as inmates or anything along that vein. The very same individuals actually assaulted one of the administrators in that facility. And if I remember, and I recall, this was going back about maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, where they actually they kicked her head into the white meat, and they broke her jaw. Then behind her, the guy that came right behind her just maybe 2 weeks ago was assaulted, and they broke his jaw, and what have you. So these are the same nonviolent young people we're talking about that everybody's saying we should raise the age. We should raise the age on.
Well, remember, 15-year-olds will still be governed under the different rules that are already in place.
That are in place. So we're just talking what, 16, 17-year-olds?
For 16 to 17-year-olds. But even in some of the most violent nature, they still will be, particularly if they're 16 or 17-year-old and it's a very violent assault, they could still be subjected to adult criminal charges.
Now also, the COBA president, on a number of interviews that I heard him talk and speak, said that there's probably upwards of about 45 recidivists that go through the system every year. Now, if they close Rikers, because remember, they're saying that Rikers is this bad place and what's craziness, there's 9 jails on Rikers Island, if I understand correctly. And it does need some infrastructural rebuilding, but we get it. We understand that this is a land grab. We all get it. My problem is, what are they going to do with those 45,000 recidivists if, in fact, that you're building these smaller jails that can only accommodate 2,500 people at most in each of the particular facilities? What do we do at that point?
I think when people talk about the reasons to close Rikers, people feel that one of the things that helps rehabilitate somebody is closeness and proximity to their families, and that one of the major complaints is it's very difficult for families to get to Rikers Island. And if there's this belief that bail reform and discovery reform and speedy trial, if you don't have people waiting months and months and months before their trials will happen, there is that belief. So just closing Rikers in and by itself is not the answer to so-called criminal justice reform. It's getting people closer to their families, and then also having the 3 legs of criminal justice reform would help to reduce the population. And in some cases, if people are on the path of rehabilitation and are surrounded by family, able to get visits from family, that maybe the recidivism is lessened.
The other thing I wanted to talk with you about is that the mayor is now sanctioning the opening of heroin shooting galleries. And not to date you, but quite frankly, going back to the 80s, we know what crack did in the Bronx and Brooklyn and what have you. Is that a good idea?
I understand the mayor's reasoning behind it because of the high incidences of people overdosing, and that if people are going to overdose, those sites would have the medicine to reverse it. So I understand the reasoning behind it, but then in some way you're condoning the use of it. So I can understand both sides of it. But I'd like to go back to understanding and trying to prevent people from using these drugs in the first place.
Got you. On a softer note, your fellow Bronxite and good friend, Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., he was on our show and he announced that he has intentions of running for mayor. What's your thoughts about a mayor, Ruben Diaz Jr.?
I mean, I don't know how political I can get in this interview, but
you can go for it.
I'm going to be one of his biggest supporters. I think Ruben epitomizes the New York story. He's a young man. He's a teenage father, but has gone on to marry the love of his life, raised two sons. One graduated from Boston College, another one from Temple, who's now an officer in the military. And if you look at, notwithstanding what's happened in the Bronx the last couple of weeks, if you go back to the World Series in 1976 when Howard Cosell was yelling that the Bronx was burning, the Bronx is a different place. It's on the comeback.
Right.
People are locating to the Bronx. There's a lot of housing that's being developed. Businesses, people want to come to the Bronx. And I think when Ruben first became borough president, the Bronx was last or first, whichever way you want to say it, in terms of unemployment. But it's now 14th. It's improved 14 places since Ruben has become borough president. I think if people see what Ruben has done for the Bronx, and I think if they give him the opportunity to do it for the city, I think they'd be very happy that a city that raised him to be a good husband and a good father, that he could do wonderful things for the city.
Well, it'll be historical. First and foremost, it'll be the first Latino mayor, quite frankly, which is great.
I think that would be great, but I think that's more of an academic part of it.
Right. I'm
not saying that people should support Ruben because he's Latino or Puerto Rican, but I do like breaking glass ceilings. I know my community was very proud when I was able to get this job, and I'm sure the Latino community will be proud as well. But Ruben brings much more to the table than just being Latino or Puerto Rican.
What would his mayoralty mean with regards to better city and state relationships?
I think that for me, I have a good relationship with the city. I try to work well, with the mayor. And regardless of who the mayor was, even if it was Giuliani and Bloomberg, it's still the city that I live in and I love, and I got to come home here. So it's really not about so much the relationship with the mayor, even though I feel I have a good relationship with Mayor de Blasio, and I'm sure I'd have an extraordinary one with Mayor Diaz. But it's my home city, so I'm always going to want to look out for my home city.
So I'm going to close out with two more questions real quick. The first one is, what's your aspirations? Are we looking at a future governor here as well?
No, this is the last political position that I'll hold. I enjoy doing this job, and as long as my colleagues want me and my constituents want to keep sending me to Albany, I do want to do this job a little while longer, but I have no desire to run for anything else. I have
no other aspirations.
I have the greatest job in the world, being a Speaker of the Assembly and the Assembly member for the 83rd Assembly District.
Appreciate you, big brother. Thank you, man.
Thank you. All right.
So there you have it, the first African-American Speaker of the New York State Assembly, Carl Heastie. This coming 1 week after we brought you the first African-American woman District Attorney, Darcel Clarke, in New York State's history. What you heard Speaker Hasty say was when he was named Speaker, he wanted to push a family-first agenda, an outlook and priorities lacking from many other politicians. This is a monumental undertaking that requires a Herculean effort. Imagine a politician thinking about families, someone who has pushed under his short time as Speaker education, legal justice reform, and is talking about listening to the concerns of his constituents. He's proving it's not enough to break through the glass ceiling by being the first African-American Speaker. You need to get things done. We'll be keeping the score.